we will start the webinar here. So I want to start by saying thank you so much to everybody who is attending. Thank you so much to the Global Disability Summit for allowing us to hold this side event, to INEE for supporting the webinar as well. And we are just so excited to be sharing with you this presentation and our speakers and the wonderful case studies that we have today. So this is the Inclusive Education Case Studies and INEE Minimum Standards side event being held by the Inclusive Education Task Team. My name is Yasmina Haddad, and I am a research associate at the American Institutes for Research. But today I am here as the co-convener for the Inclusive Education Task Team. My other co-conveners are Charlotte Burquin of UNHCR and Benjamin Bach of the International Rescue Committee. And we are excited to use this presentation, this webinar today to highlight our members as well as the other amazing work that INEE is doing in the inclusive education space. So first, I'd like to start off with our webinar housekeeping. I want to ensure that the participants in audio video are disabled. Please post your questions using the Q&A function at any time. This session is being recorded. Closed captioning is available in English as well as American Sign Language. And the recording and presentations will be shared on the INEE website after the webinar. So this is our agenda for today for the side event. We will start off with an overview of the minimum standards by INEE's Inclusive Education Coordinator, Miriam Jaffer. She will then also go over the inclusive education resources that INEE currently has to offer. Then we have our case studies as well as a presentation from consultants who have been doing very important work with the minimum standards updates. And at the end, we will offer opportunities for all of our attendees to be a part of this collective action for inclusive education and education in emergencies. And we will round out the webinar with hopefully a very engaging Q&A. So like I said, please, if you have any questions throughout the process, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A chat or in the chat, and we will definitely get to them at the end of our presentation. So just to start us off, this is Miriam Jaffer, who is the Inclusive Education Coordinator at INEE.
Thank you, Yasmina. Thank you. Welcome again to this Global Disability Summit event organized, a site event organized by the INEE's Inclusive Education Task Team. I am Miriam Jaffer, as Yasmina said, Inclusive Education Coordinator working with the INEE. We wanted to start by giving a general overview of the INEE minimum standards before sharing the case studies and the work done around the minimum standards update. The INEE's minimum standards express a commitment that all individuals, children, youth, and adults have a right to education during emergencies and fragile contexts. The minimum standards wheel to the right is like a visual summary. In the center, we can see the 4 minimum standards domain, which are access and learning environment, teaching and learning, teachers and other educational personnel, and education policy. While on the outside, in the circle, the foundational standards that are cross-cutting with all the other domains. In a nutshell, this wheel helps visualize how all the components of the minimum standards interconnect. Next slide, please. The aim of the Minimum Standards Handbook that could be found translated into many languages on the INEE website is 1, to enhance the quality of educational preparedness, response, and recovery. 2, to increase access to safe and relevant learning opportunities for all learners, regardless of their age, gender, or abilities. And to ensure accountability and strong coordination in the provision of education in emergencies through to recovery. INEE is embarking on reviewing the current edition of the INEE Minimum Standards 2010 with an inclusive education lens, with a particular focus on disability and gender. More details will be shared by other panelists and colleagues today. In addition to the Minimum Standards Handbook, the INEE published in 2010 the Pocket Guide to Supporting Learners with Disabilities. Next slide, please. This pocket guide supporting learners with disabilities is specifically aimed at providing practical ideas for including children and young people with disabilities in education before, during, or after a crisis. Although we use the words school and classroom, the advice can be applied to other child-friendly spaces or non-formal learning centers. The guide helps strengthen the efforts of anyone working with teachers or facilitators in a crisis context, whether as part of the formal education system or non-governmental program. Thank you. Over to you, Yasmina.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for that very helpful overview of both the minimum standards as well as other resources that INEE has to offer in the inclusive education space. So to start us off, we will have Mr. Julius Namasano. Mr. Julius designs learning programs and instructional materials in the form of accelerated learning for students with disabilities. Mr. Namasano is a member of the INEE Inclusive Education Task Team and currently works with the Nakivubo Education Center, coordinating distance education for urban refugees in Kampala, Uganda. Due to technical difficulties, we had a plan B put in process so that we have videos of Mr. Namasano sharing his presentation. So I'm going to set that up right now. We just wanted to ensure that we can have him speaking here. All right. So now I will share Mr. Julius's presentation. He is also on the call today. We hope that he will be able to share live during the Q&A portion of this webinar. If not, if technical difficulties continue to be an issue, we will absolutely send any questions that might be directed towards his presentation to him, and he will be able to respond directly. So again, here is Mr. Namasano.
Yeah, I salute everyone who is attending this important summit, the Global Summit on Disability 2022, on this date of the 16th February. I'm Julius Namisano from Uganda, and I work with the Nakivubo Education Center with inclusive education. I design learning materials that respond to the needs of urban refugees in Uganda and the people with the disabilities. My presentation will be in 4 parts. Part 1, we shall be looking at the minimum standards as a means for designing accelerated learning program, which we use here in Uganda. Then part 2, I will be sharing with you the outcomes of the use of accelerated program. Part 3, we shall share the challenges. And the part 4 will highlight the recommendations here given that we look forward to share and probably find medicine or find a solution for improving the challenges here highlighted. Accelerated Learning Program is a program designed after clear analysis of the minimum standards. Like I shared with you, minimum standards are a focus. They guide you during the times of emergencies. They maintain you to be focused about maintaining education quality. So minimum standards give you a guide, give you a thinking, give you an assessment to design what will be best as a method in a particular emergency situation. So we use minimum standards to create the accelerated learning program. And this accelerated learning program is what we implement here in Uganda, and it has been useful. The usefulness are seen from the idea that accelerated learning program allows these people with disabilities to come back to class. At this time, we are sharing the outcomes of the use of Accelerated Learning Program. Accelerated Learning Program, upon implementation, has given us better results. It has given us good results in terms of enrollment. We have had about 1,100 students sitting examinations at primary living examination level, those who are using Accelerated Learning Program. And as I said, these are already adults. Some of them are mothers. So they come back and then we help them. And at most, you find that they become very fantastic in terms of learning. We have had 400 students and Accelerated Learning Program get to sit ordinary level examinations in Uganda. We have also had 502 sit advanced studies. These are students who, upon passing, they join universities here in Uganda and or elsewhere. So, this program alone serves people with disabilities. Remember, disability is not an inability. Somebody may have a disability, but mentally very, very able. So what do we do with such a person? We find that the person cannot move. But how do we come in? To come in, we design learning materials that will respond to the needs of learning of such a person. And that is what we emphasize on teaching in emergency situations. Like I said, now all these outcomes, they come a result of looking at access to learning environment. How do you design access to learning environment in emergencies? We look at teaching and learning. We look at teaching and other professionals. These professionals we have, they maintain the standards. That we don't say that because it is an emergency situation, therefore anyone can teach. We now look at the challenges we face during the implementation of the Accelerated Learning Program. The use of Accelerated Learning Program sometimes hits a little bit of a snag. We get into sometimes problems or difficulties. Sometimes due to the diversity in terms of disabilities, it becomes very difficult to satisfy the needs of all learners with disabilities. This is when you cannot do it. You feel you should do it, but you are unable. So this kind of challenge makes us a little bit get demoralized. So we cannot do it, but yet we are willing, we want to do it, but we are unable. So we also look at another challenge, that it becomes very expensive for the use of accelerated learning programs for students to sit practical lessons. There's also a problem of our students can wait for national examinations, which happen once in a year. And yet, through accelerated learning program, a student might study very, very well, and within 6 months, somebody is able to sit, for example, the primary living examination. But because he has to wait for the national calendar, then it becomes a problem. So we also have that inclusive education, sometimes it becomes very expensive. It becomes expensive. You may want to implement, but how are you going to take in the needs of everyone? So there it becomes very, very expensive. And sometimes Another point, another challenge is some learners need specialized learning approaches. Some of them may need learning technologies, but because we don't have all of them, then it becomes a problem on our side. So those are the challenges we face with the accelerated learning. This time we are looking at the recommendations of implementing the accelerated learning program. Due to the diversity of needs in implementing the accelerated learning program, we need to have a national catalog, a global catalog that will help us to deal with the issue of referrals. Because as personally, I have the experience designing these materials locally. But there is when you cannot do it. There is when you need another professional to take on this person. And yet it is difficult. You don't know where. You don't know how. You begin scratching. Therefore, if we designed a national catalog of stakeholders in the universities, stakeholders in inclusive education, so that they are in one platform, whereby if you need a referral, you just see visit so and so. Another recommendation, we need to hold exhibitions. These exhibitions, they can be platforms for sharing ideas, platforms for creating referrals, especially for people with disabilities. There's another recommendation is we partner with authors who can write e-books and also books of ordinary books, these hard copy books, to come and partner with the Intelligence Network for Education in Emergencies. Then we help out these people. We also, another is to have the support of we support the case studies to become centers of learning, so that this we can expand on the case studies, improve them, so that they can be centers of learning. Finally, I call upon the international NGOs, the donor community, to come together so that we can design this national catalog of inclusive education stakeholders. We hold exhibitions so that we ease the problem with accessing education. Thank you very much. That was my presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again to Julius for recording those videos prior to this webinar. Next, we have our second case study, which will be presented by Veronica Kang, who is a board certified behavior analyst and a PhD candidate in special education at the University of Illinois, Chicago in the United States. Veronica is passionate about community-based research, teacher professional preparation, and community outreach. She is also a member of the Inclusive Education Task Team. Over to you, Veronica.
Thank you, Yasmina. I'm very happy to share a little bit about what I learned from the minimum standards and how they have been applied to my work in terms of community-based family training and intervention programs. So the first case study here shows a little bit of what I found from interview and focus group studies with immigrant caregivers of children with disabilities in the United States. So on the right side, you see the family systems framework, which inform how I better understand the experiences and perspectives of the families and from their narratives. So if you click from this slide, you'll see one box that comes up, which kind of summarizes what the caregivers shared in terms of their family characteristics. So as we can imagine, immigrant families often come from very unique and diverse culture and language background. And in addition, we cannot forget about the concept of intersectionality. So not just culture and language, but also gender, ability, and how they all play a role together to create unique experience and unique needs, and how that has to be considered to be individualized in the educational process. So for example, fathers often shared from my interview study that when they first began participating in early intervention, they wanted to know what early intervention means, what autism means, and how to seek for services for diagnostic evaluation, how the referral and waitlist process works, where to contact to connect with family service providers. So in addition to just the simple communication with professionals, families often noted that there were greater challenges at the very beginning as they try to seek for resources and services for their children. The second box here shows a summary of what families have shared in terms of their family interaction. So as you can imagine, raising a child alone, as well as understanding the child's disability, as well as understanding the early intervention and special education system in the United States, in a new country, speaking a different language, all of those things may contribute to a unique set of experiences. It may be between the caregiver interaction as well as sibling relationship. So in my next few slides later on in my presentation, I'll share how I aim to involve family members as I provide interventions to young children. And the third box on this slide kind of summarizes the family functioning described by the families. So in order for both students and families to function as equal member of the society, it's important to consider equal access, which is one of the key topics that's highlighted in INEE's minimum standards. So thinking about how the intervention programs truly mirror students and families' experiences and values, and also thinking about the different types of roles families might be participating in as a caregiver, as an employee, as an immigrant in the US, and also some of the challenges such as financial concerns they may experience. Families often desire greater opportunities for inclusive education. So not only ability, but also gender and race, culture and language, and how all of these factors can be reflected and integrated even in very young children's classroom experience. The next slide summarizes the second part of my work, which focused on family training and family-based intervention for young learners. So the first box on this slide kind of shows one aspect of how family-centered and culturally responsive intervention can be developed. On the right side of this slide, you see the ecological systems framework that introduces us to the idea that in order to better understand and support students, we want to understand their interaction with their families, as well as teachers or other professionals they collaborate with, and how they navigate through the different services and the systems in the United States, and how their culture and language play a role. So to be able to develop a meaningful intervention and educational experience, it's important to consider their natural setting and agent. And the purpose of that is to be able to promote generalization. We want children to not only excel in their academic skills in classroom settings, but to be able to interact with their peers, family members, siblings, and neighbors in the larger community. It's also important to consider student preferred materials and activities, and that purpose is to increase student engagement and motivation. We know that in order to promote truly inclusive education, we want to think about what student prefers, what they're interested in, what their strengths are, what cultural background they come from, so that they are truly excited and interested to learn new and practice new skills. The next slide shows one example, a snippet of one one of the programs that I've been doing in the community. So I have been visiting families home with COVID over virtual platform, but pre-COVID through home visits to train caregivers to implement evidence-based intervention to their children. So this particular example illustrates the social story intervention with self-modeling. So this intervention had culture and language adaptation for several factors. First, we considered the family's primary language. So this social story intervention involves some visuals and narratives to introduce new set of behaviors, new social communication skill, or scenarios so that children with autism could better understand and adjust to new environment or expectations. By using the family's primary language, children as well as their caregivers are able to understand and keep practicing the new introduced skills. Also, as you can see in the picture, family and the students' own pictures are used, and that creates more relevance and connection to the new introduced skills and ideas that are presented in the story. And finally, caregivers were the primary decision makers in developing the goals for this intervention, determining the procedures, and evaluating the outcomes. On the next slide, we're going to see one example of how caregivers were provided with an opportunity to evaluate the intervention. So one idea is to do it through this type of questionnaire. So here you see a usage rating profile developed by the University of Connecticut or University of Connecticut, and they allowed one child version and one caregiver version or a teacher version where they're able to evaluate the feasibility, the acceptability, and how it reflects the larger system within the family or classroom. So by using this type of questionnaire, or maybe another way could be using interviews. And in lay terms, just kind of keeping active communication with the natural agents of the students, we're able to better understand what has been really meaningful as a part of our intervention process, what can be changed, and what has to be improved in the next delivery of intervention, so that families are at the center of evaluating and informing the practitioners to create a truly inclusive experience. The final slide summarizes the three boxes that illustrates an overview of how the INEE's minimum standards have informed my research and practice in the community with the families. So the key kind of main ideas I wanted to share with you was to really think about how we can engage families and also peers, so the natural agents in students' day-to-day experience. So they can be, there are a lot of research that looks at peer-mediated model and also family training. Recent work in my collaboration has been on sibling training for children with autism. So how can they involve multiple stakeholders in the delivery process? And the second point you see here is in terms of equal access. So also thinking about the intersectionality that each student may come from and how this background has to be truly reflected to be able to create and facilitate meaningful, inclusive experience for all learners and families. And finally, and most importantly, thinking about the students and putting students at the center. So not just thinking about one size fits all model, but how we can individualize our educational and intervention programs. What do students prefer? What are their strengths? What are their interests? What are their hopes and dreams? And really communicating with the students and understanding their experiences so that they can be at the center of the learning experience through promoting self-modeling, self-management skills, as well as self-determination skill that really allows students to advocate for themselves in their learning experience and in their partnership with schools and other professionals in the community. I'm truly grateful in my involvement at the INEE Inclusive Education Task Team and the opportunity today to share with you a little bit about how INEE's minimum standards has really benefited my work with the families in the community. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Veronica. That was wonderful. And thank you again to Julius, both of you, for being such wonderful and engaging members of the Inclusive Education Task Team. We are so grateful to have had this opportunity to highlight our members as well as their case studies here today. Next, we are going to shift over to hearing from Ariel Solari, who is a member of the INEE Secretariat and the INEE Coordinator for Standards and Practice. And he will speak to us more about the forthcoming updates of the minimum standards.
Thank you, everybody. I would like to start by saying thanks to Julius and Veronica for such wonderful examples on how to use the minimum standards in the daily work with that has the children and the youth at its center. Well, the first slide, I'm going to explain very briefly why are we updating the minimum standards and what is the scope of the update. The current version of the minimum standards that all of us are using is from 2010. So it has been 11 years since it has been written and updated. So there has been a lot of changes in the humanitarian world, in the world of the education, and in the world in general. So we would like to have the new updates and the new coming events, the new topics, the new ways for education included in the new version of the minimum standards. What is going to be the scope of the update? Well, the previous and background work has proven and pointed that the existing architectures of the minimum standards in domains and standards are still strong. So we are not aiming to alter these current structures, but to update the content and the format. And I would like to stress that the update is also by format. That is very important for the inclusive education community. So the final output of this process will be a new and updated, accessible and adaptable version of the INEE minimum standards. Next slide, please. Well, the minimum standards has 4 phases. I'm going to focus today only on the phase 1 groundwork. That is the one that we are currently undertaking, that started in October and hopefully will end of March. This groundwork is mainly the consultation process where we are undertaking an usage assessment of the minimum standards. We are also undertaking 3 thematics review. The first one is gender and inclusive education that our next speakers are going to explain more in detail. The other thematic review is anti-racism and decolonization, and the other thematic review is early childhood development. The other process about the groundwork is where we are doing a global consultation that also has 2 parts. One is an online consultation, and the other is an offline presentation. And I'm going to explain this both in the next slide, please. What you see in this map is the focus that INEE is taking on the offline consultation. Even though in these days nothing is completely offline, what we are aiming with these focus countries is to consult the country stakeholders that are the implementers, practitioners, policymakers that has something to say about the content and the format of the minimum standards. We are gathering their opinions and inputs so to incorporate it in the new version. And we are going to explain why we are saying that this is offline, because with Julius, we saw that sometimes connection and Zoom and internet is very challenging. So we are having focused people in each of these countries that are going to and are currently undertaking key informants interview and implementing focus group discussions offline, meaning face-to-face or using the usual phone methodology, not always relying on internet access of the people. By this methodology, we would like to wider and open the scope of the people who can provide inputs to the minimum standards update. By the way, all these countries will have a specific focus on questions on the key assessments or interviews on disability and inclusion. The other part that we are going to do is the online assessment and consultation. What we will use online methodologies like online meetings, workshops, distribution of online key questionnaires and surveys and interviews. By this, we are going to have three kinds of inputs: the country level, the regional level, and the global level, that will result in a summary of topics that will be included in the new version of the minimum standards update. Next slide, please. And here is where we need the support and the participation of all the people who are attending this event of the Global Disability Summit, because, as I said before, all the countries that I shown before are going to do the offline consultation, including a question about inclusion and disability, but we are also doing an online survey. And here is where INEE needs your participation. We would like to distribute the online questionnaire to all the participants of this event, as well as we are going to do to all the 18,000 plus INEE members, so we can gather their opinions. The other thing that we are doing specifically about disability and inclusion for the minimum standards update is what Carly and Hadi are going to talk about in the next presentation, as that we did a specific and thorough thematic review on the topic. So this is the end of my presentation, and opening the floor for Carly and Hadi in their next talk. But I would like to end this part of the session with sharing with you the ways that you can participate. That is by joining the Slack channel of the Minimum Standards Update, by keeping your membership with INEE up to date, or by communicating with the MS update at INEE.org email that is open for any kind of question that you may have. So thank you very much for all of you in your participation, and I will hand over to Carly and Hadi next. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ariel, for your presentation and for offering our attendees an opportunity to be involved in this MS update. Now we have Dr. Carly Mannion and Dr. Hadi Njai, both consultants for the Gender, Disability, and Inclusive Education Thematic Review. Today we are joined by Dr. Hadi Njai, who hails from the Gambia, West Africa. She's a teaching assistant professor in international studies, as well as the International Studies Minor Coordinator and Advisor and Africana Studies Curriculum Coordinator at North Carolina State University. Thanks again for joining us, and over to you, Hadi.
Thank you for the invite. I am happy to present on the work Caroline Mannion and I have been doing since this past summer as a part of efforts to update the INEE MS 2010. The goals of our project, broadly summarized, are to conduct a thematic review of the INEE MS 2010 and associated resources using gender, disability, and inclusive education lenses. We also provided evidence-based recommendations and other inputs to support the process of updating and mainstreaming gender, disability, and inclusion in the INEE MS and supporting tools and resources. Next slide, please. So our work involves the development of a number of deliverables, beginning with a literature review, where we identified and extracted relevant data and information on gender, disability, and inclusive education, both in the scholarly and gray literature within the development and humanitarian context. The sources that we draw upon were published between 2010 to 2021. The next deliverable was an annotated review of the INEE MS 2010, which we gave multiple close readings, and we compared the content of the INEE MS with the findings from the literature review that we've conducted. And then Carly and I engaged the discussions by looking at the areas of convergence and divergence between the content of the INEE MS 2010 and those that are found in the literature that we reviewed, which led us to the development of the analytical report, in which we summarized the status of gender, disability, and inclusive education in the INEE MS 2010. We identified strengths that may be built upon and opportunities to advance the inclusive education agenda, including specifically with respect to gender and disability. We identified gaps or weaknesses in the content and language used in the MS with respect to gender equality in and through education, disability, and inclusive education. And we offer recommendations concerning where, what, and how the MS may be updated to reflect current knowledge and practice. Next slide, please. Our overarching recommendations are first to update MS to align with international development and humanitarian frameworks. At the time of the development of MS 2010, the Millennium Development Goals were in progress. However, those goals have now been replaced with the Sustainable Development Goals, and therefore that alignment is important. We suggested a stronger and clearer signaling of equity, equality, inclusion goals as important education response goals. The MS is very much clear about the focus of providing quality education and makes it a right. However, we think that it is important to include goals of equity, equality, and inclusion as things that are important in educational responses. We suggested the integration of intersectionality approaches as a way to help account for and address the needs of diverse learners. We approach that with the understanding that different identities can intersect in ways that they can compound vulnerability or reduce vulnerability. For instance, learners with disabilities are amongst the most excluded groups from education. However, girls with disabilities who are especially from low socioeconomic status may face even more disadvantage or exclusion. We suggested the clarifying and amplifying of disability and inclusion related content in the MS 2010. First off, beginning with the clarification and consistency in the use of inclusive education. So inclusive education in the literature is used in two ways, the general and the disability focus. In the MS 2010, the approach centers on the general. So therefore, it is important that inclusive education is focused on disability and disability needs. So yeah, the MS does not describe inclusive education specifically enough, and therefore it is important to really hit on the disability aspect of that inclusive education, by also considering factors such as low socioeconomic status of learners, their ethnicity, caste, language, etc., as a way to broaden the intersectionality as a way to be able to assess needs more specifically. So we also suggested the expansion and deepening of disability-related content. We've seen that disability does not figure quite greatly in the 5 domains. So there is specific absence of disability content in the domains 1, which is the foundational domain on participation, coordination, and analysis, and 3 in the domain that concerns teaching and learning, and 4 in the domain concerning teachers and educational personnel, and 5 in the aspect of education policies. So there is need for more expansion and deepening of disability-related content across the 4 or 5 domains, all of the domains of the MS. Next slide, please. So we also suggested the identifying and addressing of barriers to disability, inclusive education, and inclusive education more broadly. The MS 2010 emphasized physical barriers to disability, inclusive education. We think that, and consistent with the knowledge in the literature, it is important to pay attention to attitudinal barriers. Example, those within the families, communities, and schools that can add barriers and exclusion to the access of persons with disabilities. We suggested the collection and use of disability aggregated data as an opportunity and way to assess more specifically different disability needs. We recognize different types of disabilities. The literature describes situations in which inclusive education advocacy and related policy and programming has resulted in certain forms of disability, receiving more attention than other forms of disabilities. For instance, there is more focus on sensory-related disabilities than those that concern intellectual and communication disabilities. There is opportunity for the MS to make explicit such risks and consideration in addition to integrating more disability-specific information and guidance throughout. We suggest the use of people-first language consistent with the evolution in the literature, and that clarifies the need to prime or bring the individual first before their disability. So in the MS, there is the use of words such as disabled people or disabled children. So we suggested, consistent with the evolution of the literature, to use person first before disability. Next slide, please. Yes, so yeah, I think that was where our presentation stopped, and I'll be happy to answer questions you may have about the work that Caroline Manion and I have been doing as a part of the process to update the MS 2010. Thank you again for the opportunity and the invite to be a part of this gathering.
Thank you so much, Hadi, for sharing your amazing work along with Carly. It sounds like it was very time intensive, and hopefully, and I expect that it will be very impactful in the next version of the INEE Minimum Standards. So moving forward, we are going to turn it to Miriam to wrap us up. But before then, I wanted to mention again, please, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to put them in the chat box or in the Q&A function. We've already had some great questions coming in, and we are looking forward to a fruitful discussion after Miriam wraps us up.
Thank you, Yasmina. I will, as you said, I'll go through the few opportunities in the near future, and we take it from there. So in the near future, there will be many opportunities for INEE members and partners to engage in collective action for inclusive education and emergencies. These actions are intended to be done through INEE member bodies, broader network members, colleagues in other sectors whose work touches inclusive education, children living with disabilities, and education broadly, partners, grassroots organizations, local resources, underrepresented groups, girls, boys, and other people living with disabilities. Next slide, please. We would like to inform you about upcoming work that the INEE will be embarking on, and which we are looking forward to engaging our members, including many of you in the audience, to develop. This work is being supported by Education Cannot Wait through the ECW Acceleration Facility, and it provides the INEE network and its members with an opportunity to move the needle forward in terms of resources available on inclusive education and crisis-affected contexts, and to meet some of the objectives of the Global Disability Summit, especially in terms of showcasing best practice and evidence from across the world on disability inclusive education. Some of the work that we are working on include developing inclusive education evidence map of resources on inclusive education, plus crisis-affected context, inclusive education principles and taxonomy, with specific emphasis on disability and children living with disabilities. A report on inclusive education and disability in crisis context based on available data, illustrating examples of good practice as well as challenges. Produce 1 or 2 inclusive education in emergencies, tools or resources with associated guidance that fill key gaps identified in the mapping exercise and gap analysis and meaningfully integrate cross-cutting areas like gender, race, ethnicity, ability, and other points of social marginalization. We are in the early stages of development and look forward to engaging you in this as we get into the implementation phase of this work. As with all the INEE tools and resources, they are developed through a collaborative interagency process, and this is what strengthens the final products. We may be reaching out to you based on your participation in this event, so stay tuned. Next slide, please. INEE submitted a commitment on the occasion of the Global Disability Summit 2022, which is related to reviewing and updating the INEE Minimum Standards Handbook with an inclusive education lens as part of the INEE MS update process taking place in 2022. As mentioned earlier, in 2021, INEE worked with experienced consultants like Hadi Carly to conduct a review and mapping of references to gender, disability, and inclusive education in the INEE minimum standards, identify gaps, and provide recommendations on how to mainstream gender, disability, and inclusion at large across the INEE minimum standards. The consultants also provided references to more up-to-date gender and inclusion guidance for the education and emergency sector. This feedback will be used as a basis for consultations with gender and disability inclusion specialists in 2022, including from the INEE Inclusive Education and Gender Task Teams, to inform the update of the INEE minimum standards with new evidence and good practice. Next slide, please. Last but not least, we would like to highlight that the INEE commitment and work is in line with the principle of leave no one behind, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, UNCRPD, especially Articles 6, 7, and 24. Article 6, related to women with disabilities. Article 7, children with disabilities. Article 24, education. And the humanitarian inclusion standards for older people and people with disabilities. Thank you so much for attending this event and for listening. Over to you, Yasmina.
Thank you so much, Miriam. At this point, we are going to move into our question and answer portion of this event. So I will stop my screen share, and if all the panelists could please turn on your videos so we could see you and engage with you. Thank you. I believe that's everybody. Great. Thank you so much again to all of you for presenting today, and also for the work that has led up for you to be able to present today. As somebody who is a big supporter of the INEE minimum standards, it was very exciting to see how you are using them in your work, and also, Ariel, how you plan to expand on it and improve it in the future. To start off, we have a great question that is kind of a general question for all those here on the panel today. Please feel free to answer as you see fit, and go ahead and take turns as you'd like. So the question is, what will it take to move organizations beyond just acknowledging with words that disability inclusion is important to actually planning for and implementing fully disability inclusive practices in all EIE programs?
I'm happy to answer the question briefly, and then also pass it on to other panelists. I think that's a really important and valuable question. One idea that comes up to my mind is to really center self-advocates and family advocates at the center of our practice and in this type of discussion and research. So that obviously includes, for example, if within your community or within your organization, maybe creating a small group where individuals with diverse abilities and maybe their family members can be kind of informing and guiding us through our directions in terms of what type of research has to be conducted, how the program has to be adapted to truly mirror and really benefit their kind of day-to-day experience, and what their challenges and barriers are and how that has to be addressed from their perspective, I think is really valuable. It might take a while for us to kind of reach out to all of the kind of the underrepresented communities and truly kind of seek for everyone's perspectives and experience, but that's at least my goal, step by step, to be able to really engage in active communication with them and then kind of inform myself from their perspectives and their narratives.
Wonderful. Thank you, Veronica. Hadi or Ariel, do you have any comments?
Yes, sure. I guess I deeply think that the strengthening of the inclusive and disability in the minimum standards will also provide the global background for different organizations to acknowledge, mainstream, and institutionalize the approach to inclusive education. I mean, the minimum standards are a global tool, are not a binding tool, but are very strong in its use, as Veronica and Julius shown. So the strengthening of the minimum standards on not only on the content, but also in the format that take into account inclusion and disability will be one of the efforts and steps to mainstream and institutionalize the inclusion and disability with different type of organization and stakeholders. Thank you.
All right. To add on to what Ariel and Veronica said, I think the first place to start with is commitment, right? So that our beautiful, informative studies are being followed through with the commitment to implement something that is tangible and of substance. I think the foundational domain one, if employed, may lead to the development of relevant programs that can be of benefit to beneficiaries. And what it asks for is participation, including people whose needs are being developed in educational responses, and engaging them, coordinating and working with them in identifying, doing need assessment and working towards what exactly it is they need in educational response planning. I think if domain one is effectively employed, it can be a step further in thinking about how to more concretely develop educational response strategies that will meet the need and aspirations of persons with disabilities, learners, and of course their families and communities.
Right. Thank you all so much. Those were great answers. Something that I'm noticing in the list of participants is I think we have a range from people who are experts in the minimum standards to people who may or may not have ever heard of the minimum standards before today. As three people who are so aware of and experienced using the minimum standards, could you give us some insights into how you use it? Is it something you open before your program is even implemented, when you're planning? How do you use the minimum standards and throughout your work to make sure that it's something that's always supporting you and something you're following?
I think engaging in our kind of regular meetings have been helpful. That's just one, I think, example, just to learn from how others have been applying the minimum standards through their work. And obviously, because every person has slightly different kind of goals and their kind of field is slightly different. So to be able to hear from their perspective also allows me to kind of get new ideas for my work in terms of community-based research and intervention for young learners in the community. And then I guess this type of conversation, kind of looking through the minimum standards, and if it's actually simple step as going through the list and checking, like, am I really truly meeting maybe one or two minimum standards or all domains within the minimum standards? I think that kind of self-reflection and evaluation is really important too. And to be very honest, I think engaging in our conversation today, preparing for our meeting today allowed me to engage in that self-reflection. So I'm grateful that I engage in that kind of process, and my goal is to continue being involved in kind of that self-reflection to kind of continue to improve my practice in alignment with the minimum standards.
Great, thank you, Veronica. Do any other panelists have responses?
Well, I mean, I mean the standards and practices of the day, so the usage of the minimum standards are like my everyday things. But I would like to emphasize something that we always discuss and try to take forward in the standards and practice team with my colleagues Charlotte, Bente, and Kinana, is the holistic approach to the minimum standards, as Miriam was pointing on the beginning with the wheel. All the interconnections that are there, and the possibility to use the minimum standards in all the phases of the program management or the program development, from the design to implementation up to evaluation. And not only in the program implementation, but also in the advocacy and policy work. We need to keep in mind that there's domains and standards specific dedicated to that can be very useful also to address the first question about how to strengthen the advocacy and the policy that we need to touch upon to keep advocating forward for the mainstreaming and the usage of more inclusive and disability approaches in the different programs of education. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Veronica, something you mentioned about monitoring and evaluation being self-reflective reminded me of another resource that INEE has, which is the Minimum Standards Indicator Framework, which is something that people can use, that offers example indicators to find out how you and your program are following along with the standards in the domain. So thank you for reminding me of that. And I have shared it in the chat with everybody here today. Another question we have that was offered by one of the participants is, we have some challenges with inclusive education, especially in situations where we are lacking the facilities. How are you going to communicate with them, and I guess the question here is, how do you implement inclusive education programming when you are lacking facilities to do so?
I want to say that based on our analysis of the INEE 2010 MS and our review of the literature, there appears to be some gaps in terms of how inclusive education is conceptualized. I think the focus more broadly is on providing education to excluded groups rather than approaching inclusive education with this specific lens of mainstreaming the education of persons with disabilities, and so that they can enjoy the same rights and facilities and experiences that other learners are able to enjoy within the learning context. So I think there is need to fix that gap, so that when we talk in general terms about inclusive education, we will not lose sight of the needs of the learners with disabilities, and particularly within the
I believe we lost. Oh, thank you, Hattie. Thank you for your response. I think we lost the end of it, but I think we understood what you were saying, and it was very insightful. Thank you. I think at this time, Veronica might need to drop off. Thank you so much, Veronica, for speaking and for sharing your case study. In these last 10 or so minutes, Hattie and Ariel, we have some questions for you about how participants here and in the future can engage with the minimum standards update. For example, one question being, when will the survey be available? So if you have any additional things you want to share about how people can engage with you in your work, we would love to hear that. And then I think we have one more question and we'll wrap up.
Sure. The online survey will be, we are uploading that to the platform that we are going to use, and is going to be shared with all INEE members, and we are going to do also target distribution for a different group of stakeholders at network. And hopefully one of the target distribution that we are going to do is to the people who has been participating in this side event. So this is one of the way to participate. The other way to participate is, please go to the minimum stand, the INEE webpage, click on the how to participate and to the minimum standards update, and there you will have all the information about how to participate. I'm going to paste the link to that specific chapter of the INEE webpage right now in our chat.
Thank you.
So Kelly and I have completed almost all of the deliverables, and we are hoping that our work will offer insights and guidance as to how better to develop the MS 2010.
Great, thank you. I'm seeing now we have another question actually for you, Hadi, about your review. The question is, in your opinion, is there a difference between the updates with a gender lens versus a disability lens from a social point of view?
There may be. I want to start with the fact that disability is somewhat thinly presented in the MS 2010 content when compared to gender, but I can see ways in which both can be integrated using the intersectionality lens, because learners are not only persons with disabilities, they have gender identities. And when we frame it that way, then we will begin to understand different learning needs that are intersected with different identities. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I think there's a lot more content for gender than for disability in the MS 2010. And therefore, Kelly and I have suggested the amplifying and stronger signaling of disability related content in the MS update.
Right. Thank you so much, Hadi, for sharing. That's interesting. That's actually something that us as the Inclusive Education Task Team are working with and always trying to understand what inclusive education means. Generally, we have a disability focus in our task team, but we do have members who are also interested in, like Julius was speaking of, accelerated learning. We also have other members who are really interested in the cultural inclusion of different learners when culture might be a barrier to accessing school or accessing groups. So that's something that I think is very common across inclusive education. And that's probably why I'm just very appreciative of the Global Disability Summit for bringing this inclusive education focus on disability with also having this cross-cutting gender theme that I feel like your review has also highlighted so well. That was our last question that we have today for our panelists. So thank you all so much for joining us, and to our participants, thank you so much for being here, for spending your time today. Yes, thank you to our ASL interpreters as well as our captioners for your support and helping us make this event more inclusive as well. Again, please stay in touch with INEE, join as a member, join the community of practice, reach out to the Inclusive Education Task Team. We'd always love to hear from people interested in our work and, of course, in the minimum standards. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.